Snap 3 times if you can hear me. All right. Thank you all for joining us bright and early after another epic night of museums in the web karaoke. I'm really excited for our conversation this morning on how we can apply our unique tool set of digital technologies, physical spaces, and cultural artifacts towards the broad mission of democratic participation. We've got a great group of panelists from within and beyond the museums. Thanks to Nancy Proctor for bringing us all together and for inviting me to chair the conversation. So let's get started. I'll give brief introductions, and then we'll jump right into our discussion. On your far right, Tanner Blackman is an urban planner by training and profession who serves on the board and advises LA's Do Art Foundation, whose mission is to engage the public to do art through interaction and education. His love for the intersection of public policy, placemaking, and the arts brought him to do art, and has been a long-term theme in his work, which includes writing the ordinance to re-legalize murals in the city of Los Angeles. He believes strongly in the power of art to improve place and contribute to shared community identities. On his left, Lucy Bernholz is an internationally recognized industry analyst of philanthropy, social enterprise, and social finance, whose personal and professional lives intersect around the question of what's public, what's private, and who decides. She's currently thinking about how digital data, infrastructure, and gadgets are changing the nature of expression, privacy, and associations, like museums, libraries, protests, and movements in our, quote, digital civil societies. On her left, Gamynne Guillotte is the Director of Interpretation and Public Engagement of the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she just launched the Patricia and Mark Joseph Education Center. She creates environments, public programs, and interpretive tools that help make the museum a place of creativity, inclusion, and conversation. And on her left, John Alexander is a thinker and creative leader on a mission to support the shift in the dominant story of the individual in society from consumer to citizen. He's the founder of London-based The New Citizenship Project, whose work is underpinned by the belief that the idea of the citizen is far more interesting, enlivening, empowering, and also fundamentally more true to human nature than the idea of the consumer. The project is about finding ways to understand and unleash the power of the citizen. And I'm Nikhil, an application developer at the Art Institute of Chicago, and what informs my perspective in this conversation here is my activism work as an anti-sexual violence advocate and educator in an effort to end all forms of violence and heal our communities from historic traumas. I'm also a regular contributor to the Inclusium and co-creator of the blog Visitors of Color. So our discussion today is centered around ideas of democracy and citizenship. So I'd like us to begin by defining what we mean by these when we use these words, as an invitation to explore and complicate their meanings. When I hear the word democracy, it's often referred to as a mechanism to distribute power equally among large groups of people. But as someone who's born and raised in the United States, I come from a place that historically and presently is only able to operate as a democracy by not sharing power with all people, specifically through the exploitation of labor, land, and bodies, through everything from the system of slavery to the prison industrial complex, to the genocide of indigenous people, to gentrification, and so on, many of which are systems that museums have benefited from. And people who have different relationships to the state, like people of color, women, and other folks targeted by sexism, continue to fight every day for equal rights and shared power. Likewise, with the word citizen, we're gathered here in a nation founded by immigrants on stolen land. So if we frame our conversation around citizenship, who are we excluding? So I'd like to ask each of you to define democracy and citizenship for us. Can we discuss our ideal notions of these concepts while at the same time holding our societies accountable for the historic and current day traumas that gave rise to their current application? And I'd like to start with Gamynne.
Wow, that's a really big task. no small task there. Well, it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about citizens and publics in terms of what makes and creates a civil society. And in thinking about the public, it's a term that I think we often use in museum outreach. We talk a lot about our communities and the community to which we're going to reach out to, as though the community is something outside of ourselves, and as though the community is other. And I've been thinking a lot about the way in which publics are constructed. And I mean publics in a plural sense. There are multiple publics that exist at any given moment in time. I, as a black, college-educated woman, that's a demographic description of me, but that's not necessarily the public to which I belong. Publics are something that are constructed through the work that we do. They do not exist necessarily independently of the work that we do. So I've been thinking a lot about how publics are constituted. The artist Paul Chan gave a really great talk last fall on this issue, and he said something that really, really struck me, and that is that the public does not exist out there somewhere. The public is something that we make, maintain, and dismantle. And I thought it was an extraordinarily powerful way to think about how we're able to bring agency and allow for spaces of agency for folks who have been underrepresented and overrepresented within the same kinds of spaces. And some of those spaces are temporal. Some of those spaces do not necessarily last. They're sometimes necessarily temporary. They're sometimes project-driven. And I think that's an incredibly powerful way to start to think about how publics, plural, are constituted. That's where I start with my thinking.
Any of you all want to chime in?
Okay. Can't add much to both of those statements. I think they're right on. The one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is this weird space called civil society, or in the U.S. In a U.S. context, more often referred to as nonprofit sector or the independent sector. So just to build on what's been said, I think of this space as where we as private people voluntarily choose to use our resources to do something for others. And it's always fluid because it's always a set of choices. And it distinguishes it from the government and marketplaces, which I think are also, in our lived experience, the capitalist system is as much a factor as the small d democratic system, and we've intertwined them in ways that they may not always need to be. But if you think of the marketplace as where private people do things for private benefit, and the government space as where publics do things for public's benefit, then there's this weird other space where we have the opportunity, and I would argue the responsibility, and if you have my mother, you would also argue the responsibility, to do things as private people for publics. I like to keep the people in the picture. I don't like the word community and citizen and all that other stuff that puts boxes. I mean, we're just people. And then I guess one thing that brings me here, and I know we're going to talk about, is if you go back to that language of the independent sector as this place where we voluntarily choose as private people to use our resources for some publics, it doesn't exist in digital space at the moment, and I think it behooves us all to make sure we get it back. There is no independent sector in digital space. We access it through commercially owned gadgets, we travel on it on commercially owned infrastructure, and it's entirely monitored by governments. There is no civil society in digital space, and it's our responsibility to take it back and create it and protect it and preserve it if you actually think that something like, say, museums are important.
Yeah, I'd like to, I guess, add on that to an extent. I absolutely agree with everything said today so far. When I tend to use the words democracy and citizen, I frankly tend to use it in a fairly constrained way, given the fact that I worked in government for the city of Los Angeles as an urban planner for close to a decade, and I teach at USC's Price School of Public Policy, where, and some of what Gamynne started off really resonated with me in terms of how I've noticed at this conference over the last few days, sort of the institutions that folks represent here have a similar sort of fixation on getting, sort of message out to a certain population, getting this sort of feedback that they want and this input. And it was, a primary goal of my job for several years at the city of Los Angeles, sort of in working on the mural ordinance and other citywide public policy issues. So I think that it's really fertile ground to explore sort of how I can't wait to hear what John says more about this sort of this other space of this new citizen idea, but I tend to sort of, go back to the sort of small d democracy. In addition to working for the bureaucracy of the city, I worked for an elected office or in that capacity, and then also even served on my local neighborhood council, and have sort of seen these various levels of democratic fora in which to sort of have these conversations. And the goal of the nonprofit that I'm really here to represent today, the Do Art Foundation, is to do public art interventions in the public realm, right? In this sort of space that is all of ours. I tend to try to think of the city hall as your house, as everyone's house. And so a really fun sort of fixation of our organization is, yes, the murals that are visible from the public realm, but also then, park takeovers, or we did sort of takeovers of advertising spaces that are on all the bus benches, or using sort of just infrastructure in the public realm, like utility boxes and things like that, as sort of places to insert little conversations and make people think about space and spatiality different than they would, and sort of hopefully reclaim that space.
So I'm going to disagree with something more for the sake of it. Just to introduce something. Can you hear me? Is that cool? Yeah. And then maybe build as well. So the one thing I just want to, and it's not really a massive disagreement, it's just bring some spice to this, is this thing about not using these words and not using the language. Like I fundamentally believe that language is so important, and it's not neutral, and when we don't engage with it and don't think about it, we allow ourselves to stay in spaces and reinforce spaces that are deeply dangerous. So I won't go on about this, but because many of you are forward already the plenary the other day, but just some of the findings from the research that we've done where, for example, if you give a survey of environmental and social attitudes to 1,000 people and you put consumer response study on the front cover for 500 and citizen response study on the front cover for the other 500, you get significantly lower environmental and social motivation on the consumer response study, right? So, and we have to, and I think like the word consumer, the word consumers is used far too much as a collective noun, as a replacement for the word people, and I think not engaging deliberately with that is a mistake. So the stuff I talk about goes way deeper than the words and the language, but I think, and I want to be clear on that, like, and I am wary of some of the things as well, like as Nikhil says, the idea of the word citizen has some, as a legal construct, has some very problematic ideas to it as well. But I think it's important to engage with those things. I just wanted to say the build then, for me, two things. The first is, I think, what is it to move from talking to people as consumers to talking to the citizens? And this, what I'm really interested in here this week is, what is a democratic museum, really? And what is a democratic cultural institution? And I just wanted to throw out a sort of a horrible story, which is one of the kind of inspiring moments that inspired the creation of the New Citizenship Project. So BBC Three is a TV channel in the UK that's devoted to young diverse audiences. I won't go into why that language is used or whatever, but BBC Three is a hotbed of British creativity. The content that comes out of BBC Three is amazing. They recently ran a consultation on the future of BBC Three to decide what to do with it strategically. And to do this, they published a 100-page monochrome PDF to the BBC website with some drop-down boxes. Now, so this is what I'm talking about. When we speak to people as consumers, there's an immense amount of creativity that goes into these things, and we try and inspire and we try and engage. When we speak to people as citizens, we're like, and then we say to ourselves, people don't want to be citizens, people don't want to participate, people don't want to do this, people just want to shop. And I'm like, no, they don't! So I should have screwed that. So that's, and I guess, so what's a democratic museum? It's like, so what is it to use the same creativity that you would use to inspire people, to provide a platform for people to create culture and to curate culture themselves rather than just to deliver a visitor attraction. Sorry.
No, I appreciate you sort of bringing us back to the words that we're on hand, because I wonder about using alternatives, running the risk, how using alternative alternative words runs the risk of like erasing the histories that affect the context in which our multiple publics operate within today. And I think that's certainly part of the question of why certain people come and certain people don't. So I think that's an important piece to sort of carry on into the conversation as we continue. So I'd like to ask you guys about examples.
Well, I kind of want to dig down a little bit, if you don't mind, on the, because the word citizen, for me, in a sense, it conjures, the city, the municipality, the sort of government structure. And so I wonder, and I just want to tease it out a little bit more, because for example, there's a couple prevailing assumptions amongst public policy wonks and urban planners. I think that going back to books like 2000, Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, or something that we're in this area of this sort of diminishing sort of social capital and civic engagement and stuff, and sort of reinforced by the sort of pundit class and how we all have sort of diffuse little curated worlds of information that we receive in our own little sort of things. That's one sort of direction of sort of discourse and assumption. And then another thing where, the sort of democratization, which I really use is different than democracy pertaining to the government structure, is sort of, that diffuse spread of new technologies that enable all of us to be makers and creators and producers and contribute. And so given that discourse of sort of creators and makers, is that is that what you mean when you're using citizen? That sort of like contributing up?
So I'll be very good at this. So for me, I use these words. So I use the words subject, consumer, and citizen, and I see a kind of a journey between those things. And for me, the fundamental definition of a citizen is as opposed to a consumer, or not as opposed, but as a movement on from that. So I would say there are two fundamental differences between those two things, and that's probably the best answer I've got for you. The first is a difference of, and both are differences in terms of agency, I think. The first is a difference in terms of moral agency. So as consumers, I think the idea that's embedded in the idea of the consumer is that we are only good enough to choose what is best for us as narrowly defined individuals. That is all we are capable of. And in some ways, I think of consumerism as a slavery system in that light. It's an inferiority complex that we're kind of embedding in ourselves. So firstly, a moral agency shift. So as consumers, we're only good enough to judge what's best for us. As citizens, we're good enough to play a part in the conversation about what's best for everyone. Play a part in it, not dominate it, but play a part in it. The second difference is I think of as creative agency. So as consumers, we're only good enough, we're only able to choose between the options that are offered to us. As citizens, we're capable of playing a role in shaping what those options are. So we have a greater creative agency.
And I want to challenge and question the distinction between democracy and democratize, right? Because we're using the words democratize in the context of our institutions and the work we do, but the process of democracy is what we're sort of invoking when we use that word, and the processes of democracies being established are fraught with awful histories, right? And I think it's worth questioning the processes that we're applying within our institutions and how are we replicating those same histories. So I don't really want to make a distinction between the two.
Well, I don't really want to use the two. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I think for myself I've been moving away from that language, because while it is language, it is incredibly problematic and fraught, and I do think that there are times and instances and moments where a reclaiming of contested language is important and useful and wonderful. I think that there are also times when a radical shift away from that language allows us to think differently about problems. You say democracy, and that means something very specific within the American context. We are, of course, as we all know, a republic, not a democracy. We are a democratic republic, and that has certain implications for how we structure things. For how we structure things like focus groups when we're talking about our museum audiences. For how we structure things like visitor surveys. That's very much there. When we think about we are going to talk to our public over there, as opposed to co-creating with our publics, plural, which is why I've made that shift away from sort of thinking about democracy and public's world. Next question.
We dealt with that one. That was easy.
Done. Check. So I'd like us to talk about some of the examples of projects and places from our own work and things that we're familiar with of projects and places that have distributed power equitably, that have engaged a wide range of people. What are some examples? What has worked? What hasn't? And why?
Everyone's looking at me. So, the Baltimore Museum of Art last fall launched the rather, don't take this out of this room, unfortunately named Patricia and Mark Joseph Education Center, because nobody wants a center where nobody wants to be educated, but there we go. And it is a space that involves exhibition spaces, programmatic spaces, spaces for making, but it's really more than the physical space of the center itself. It's the center and all of its associated programming. The center has one sort of big idea that we'll be working with over the period of 3 years. Our inaugural idea was home, and we wanted an idea that the public had immediate buy-in to. Not everyone is an expert about art. Not everybody has an interest in art, but everybody is an expert about home. Everybody has an immediate and visceral relationship to it, whether that is positive or problematic. And we really sought to complicate the idea of home in all of the work that we did around this. But one of the pieces that we did that I was just telling Lucy about before we got started was a fabulous project that's still up and running called the BMA Outpost. And we had a wonderful teaching artist, Katie Bachler, who I met randomly at the Walker. I was there for something else. And I don't know if we have a lot of LA people in the audience, but she worked with Andrea Zattel at High Desert Test Sites for a long time. And thank you. And right on. And you know, she has psychographic mapping about issues around home and placemaking. I said, come to Baltimore and map Baltimore. She said, cool. We had no idea what that was going to be. We had no idea what it was going to make. It was completely open-ended. It was incredibly cheap to do. I got almost no buy-in whatsoever from anybody else at my institution to do this. And over the course of 2.5 years, what the project has evolved into is a mobile unit of the Baltimore Museum of Art. That goes out with replicas of artworks into neighborhoods all throughout Baltimore, stays for a period of 1 month in residence at various locations. Some of them kind of the usual suspects that you might expect, yes, community centers and churches and schools, but also things like farmers markets, public markets, random street corners, and engages people over time, and the time factor is so important about what home means to them. That map is then they're also asked to map what matters to them in their neighborhood, so it becomes a kind of asset mapping as well. Those maps are then aggregated and given back to members of that community, and then they travel to other communities as the outpost moves on. So it's also a teaching tool for the citizens of Baltimore to learn more about each other. Baltimore, as you may know, may have heard in the news, is a very segregated community in which people do not necessarily talk across certain political and physical boundaries within the city. And so this is something that the Outpost seeks, among other things, to address. We count this within my team as a legitimate visit to the Baltimore Museum of Art. This is not outreach in the sense of we're trying to use this to get you to come to our museum. You have come to our museum. You know, and we look at this in the same way with many of our online offerings. We're really thinking a lot about what is the Baltimore Museum of Art beyond its boundaries and beyond its collections and beyond its physical space. The last thing I'll say about this project that I've learned tremendously as a result of it, because I've thought a lot about why does it work? Why does something like this work? It works because we did not try to control it. We listened to our audiences at every step of the way. Every neighborhood that Katie went into subtly changed the project. was invited to change the project. It is never the same project twice. It always adapts itself to its circumstances and situations and learns from itself. And as a result of this, it has been perhaps the highest impact project that we have done in a sort of a multi-part project that's got a lot of energy and a lot of heat and a lot of people, and in some cases a lot of cash behind it. This is one of the quickest, dirtiest, cheapest, easiest things we've done, and it's the highest impact thing, and those are not coincidental.
Can I just jump off that, because I think that last point is so interesting and important, and one of the things I think about when I think about sort of citizenship concepts is what is it for us to be citizens in our institutions? What is it for us to kind of to claim our own agency and to do what we can do from where we are? And just as a and I think there's a lovely, I love the way you say, like, I got almost moved by it. Like, I'm sure, I suspect that's true sort of upward and probably less true sideways. I suspect you spoke to people about it and got some reinforcement. But when we think of it, but you explored your own agency, right? You did what you could do. And just to throw in on that, I spoke the other day, I touched on the example of local currency movements, which I think is something which speaks to this really powerfully. Like, it's a thing where, like, you don't have to wait for your council or your local city government or your federal government or whatever to give you permission to start to take control of your city. You like, these local currency initiatives are exactly about kind of what can we do from where we are, what agency do we have, and I think that's a really interesting place to jump off. I think, so I suppose when you turn that out to the question of what can people do, like, everyone has agency, right? We have agency to start a conversation, we have agency to start an initiative, we have agency. And it's kind of, this world comes about when we all kind of explore what that is, I think. So I love that story, and I just wanted to jump off that. So.
Well, I don't work in a museum, so I don't have any examples. And as someone who visits museums, I don't have any examples.
We actually would love examples outside the museum too.
Yeah, so thank you. But I had an experience at a museum in LA yesterday that I thought was, a typical museum experience. So I just want to ask. I mean, it's sort of a question as someone who is that visitor. The idea of a place that I help create when I get there is completely foreign to me as a museum visitor. I've never experienced it. In fact, I have way too much formal education. I have more than my fair share. And I went into this museum yesterday and I didn't understand a single word on the little things on the wall. And I was with a novelist friend of mine, someone who has a fairly extraordinary command of the English language, and the two of us, we made a museum experience by making fun of the museum's language. It was fabulous. That's legitimate.
So was it successful?
That was what they were trying to do.
I don't know. I mean, I'll let you have your own metrics. I don't have any idea. And so so an example for me, I have a lot of examples of democratic, sort of participatory creative experiences. I don't know if they result in cultural artifacts, expression, art. Talk about a lame term. I don't know. I love the experiences I've had in my own city and in Detroit and in Brooklyn of these communal, artistically generated kind of, they're not even a thing, they're not an institution. There's an experience called soup, there's an experience called feast. When you bring your stuff, your literature, your art, your kid, talk about a creation. And it's completely co-created. But I don't know that it's an experience of because there are still things that museums and libraries and galleries and archives, there's stuff. And that stuff is important. I'm an historian by training. That stuff is important. And I don't know how we navigate this. I think what we're fundamentally exploring here is the structure of institutions, both in analog community meet space, as the techies like to say, and certainly in digital space. And so I've come to this conversation really thinking, you know what would be a great example of a democratic experience of a museum? Would be if everyone in this room showed up at the decentralized web meeting in San Francisco in June, which is a gathering of the luminaries who literally built the World Wide Web the first time, who are not happy with their creation and want to recreate it. But as I said to them, you know, you guys are great, and I mean you guys are great. You built the World Wide Web. Well, the world is here now, so when you build it again, don't build it without us. And the voice of... And most important, well, from my perspective, most important, and I'll tell you why, most important for us to show up in that World Wide Web 2.0 or whatever stupid name they're going to give it, is civil society. Because you know who will get there really fast? Business and government. They're there. But we're not there. We're the museums, we're the libraries, we're the people. That's democratic museum in my mind. Sorry. So it goes from the museum out into the democracy as much as the democracy into the museum. Oh, oops. I'm totally disrupting the conference experience here.
By standing up for the question and answer. My name is Jeff Gates. I work at the Smithsonian, but I've been an artist and involved in what it means to be an artist for quite some time. In the 80s, I formed an organization called Art FPI, Artists for a Better Image, and I studied stereotypes of artists in contemporary culture. But I really want to know, what museum were you at? Will you tell us? Please tell us. It doesn't matter really, but they all do it the same.
I don't even know.
You don't even know?
I couldn't understand the sign. I don't know what
Okay, well, one thing I want to address, and it's very appropriate for today. Today is Slow Art Day. Across the world, this was started by Phil Terry, who is not in museums. He was an individual, and anybody, talk about democratization of the museum experience, anybody can basically create a meetup through the Slow Art Day website, slowartday.com, and what you do is you look the organizer, whether it's somebody from a museum or an individual who's in that museum, picks a couple art pieces to look at and contemplate. And I work in an art museum, and how many times do I actually stop and look at the art? I'm usually on my way to a meeting. It's incredible, and it's very transformative. And I think it's really, really important. The last point I'll make is that one of the reasons, I was in academia for 23 years, and I am livid about the language that's used. Part of the problem is that art museums are intrinsically connected to the art world and art history. And one time Nina Simon, who I'm sure many of you know or know of, was speaking at the Smithsonian. She said, you know, I like science museums much better than art museums. And in the back channel, yes, this man right here, raise his hand. Okay. In the back channel, I tweeted, that's because scientists work collaboratively and are interested in that collaborative experience and bringing that to the exhibitions. Whereas most curators are art historians who work by themselves. And I think that does make a very big difference about the experience that we have. And I hate, I hate the titles of the fellows.
So thank you. Sorry, I just want to make sure that people
I'll stop.
more questions. But I think that the thing, just to leave in, the thing about curators is really interesting. I think one of the things Lucy was speaking to is the objects are important. I think there is a tension here of not abandoning the idea of the importance of the collection, not abandoning the idea of the importance of the skills of the curator and so on. And I just think that, I suppose I just wanted to make the point that one of the this is like, what is it to add a layer that's like, expertise is still valued, but being able to hold the conversation around that expertise and invite people into that expertise, not just sort of broadcast it out to people, is kind of the
well, it's like this becomes a thing. Our publics are not us. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you've got the curators over here and museum professionals over here and our public over there as someone who's not us. But how do you bring all of these folks together in one place and deal with those tensions that occur? I think that those tensions around the art historical desire to impart a certain kind of specialized knowledge and information is a very real tension up against the tension of people to have a successful, whatever that means within your institution, museum experience. And how do those things start to rub against each other? Which, I'd love to sort of say very quickly and kind of open to the panel this notion of the importance of productive tension. Because I think that we work really, really hard at trying to create spaces of consensus. And trying to come to solutions. Let's make all of the visitors happy. Let's make all the curators happy. Let's find whatever our constituency is and come to some kind of resolution. And I think that if we're really talking about museums as democratic spaces, we are necessarily talking about museums as spaces that have to hold productive tension, right? And so how do we create spaces, that where it can be hard, and how do we deal with it being hard?
Can you make the signage editable? Can you make it editable? I always have a pen in my pocket. I'm a writer. I wanted to.
Wikisignage.com.
I love it.
And then you can have great conversations about it, and it can go everywhere. And not by the way, not everybody will want to do it.
So yeah, I'd like to go back, I guess, to Nikhil's question about examples and offer something from my perspective. And I want to take us back to, out of the digital space, back to the streets and the public realm for a second, where a lot of my ideas about public space were informed by the fact that I was an avid skateboarder when I was a teenager, and where I would reinterpret the handrail for a different idea than it was created for. And that's part of why I sort of love muralism, and that's sort of how throwing a painting on the wall can just reimagine a space and make people interact with it in such a different way. And so in the city of Los Angeles in 2013, we adopted a brand new mural ordinance that made murals legal again for the first time in 11 years in a city that imagines itself as the mural capital of the world. And we very consciously wrote into this new ordinance no penalties, knowing that most people are going to live and die in Los Angeles, never knowing that they have to ask permission to paint on their own walls. And so what sort of happened is there's just been this great sort of flowering of murals coming up all over the city, and a lot of folks not following the ordinance, but that's fine because murals are great. And so one example that if you guys are still in town for a day or two, just over in historic Filipino town, over off Temple Street, is a gallery called GABA Gallery that is sort of spilled out into the neighborhood in a very wonderful way, into all of these alleys. Folks are calling it the GABA district, and there's this whole animal alley aspect of it, and it's really sort of changed the place in an area that's sort of been long socioeconomically sort of depressed, and it's sort of added a sort of cool new aspect to it. One that I would encourage you to go to as well is at 5th and San Pedro in actually 6th and San Pedro is the visible side of it, in the middle of Skid Row. And it's referred to as the Skid Row Super Mural, and it's a big, giant sort of mimicking of an official city sign that says, Skid Row, population too many, establish this, and it has a sort of map of the area. And it's a really powerful thing because for what I've noticed in recent reporting since this mural was done a year and a half ago or so, was that whenever anybody's reporting on Skid Row and needs a sort of go-to image for what that is, instead of, in addition to, I guess, the typical sort of tents on the street and that, there's, often you see this image used. And it's a real sort of like, in a sense, this image of pride of the community organizers who helped it get created, in this whole history of how Skid Row's never shown up on an official map.
Tell us about how that was created and by whom, and whether the constituents of that community were involved in its creation.
That's a long story that the city struggles with every day. I mean, so the long story short, in the whole sort of slum-cleared redevelopment era of mid-20th century, the Community Redevelopment Agency and the city fathers of the time sort of had an active policy of containment, to turn a blind eye to kind of, and let all of the sorts of service organizations and stuff cluster that in an area that in the 1920s and before was sort of already had a lot of small single-room occupancy sort of tenement housing that was for short-term itinerant workers, and the city kind of just doubled down on making this the worst ghetto in the nation.
But was the mural made sort of in concert with?
So I mean, one of the main organizers of it, my organization, helped a little bit in terms of helping with the registration and stuff, but it was made by a gentleman called General Jeff, who was the organizer, he's long known as the mayor of Skid Row. He's long represented the Skid Row community on the neighborhood council and stuff. So it was a real kind of from the ground up thing that I bring it up in sort of Nikhil's framing of awful histories and whatnot. Another one kind of nearby that I love these sort of things that are able to tell the story of place and make people think about it in a different way. There's an alley off of Winston Street between Maine and Los Angeles that is referred to as Indian Alley now. There's a gallery inside a building right next to the gallery called These Days LA, and the building itself was the headquarters of the American Indian movement from the 1970s through the 1990s. And there's a project in Indian Alley to sort of do all of these sort of Native American themed murals along the alley, and it's actually gotten a lot of sort of attention and press in the sort of Native discourse and Native press. And one thing I was able to kind of help along that was when I was still working for the council member by kind of allowing the project to sort of grow outside of the alley and into the surrounding streets and stuff as well through using utility boxes and yada yada. So I've really been kind of love to see how when the policy changed to allow sort of art to flower, murals happen again in the city, that how these sort of really unique and legitimate and authentic sort of community voices are able to kind of find their ways of expressing them.
Cool. I've got a lot of questions, but I want to leave time for the rest of what we had planned on talking about today. For this last question, I'm particularly interested in hearing your perspectives as people outside the museum field. And for those of us in the field, I challenge bravery to challenge our colleagues. What could this group do? We're talking to a room full of people who produce, manage, develop, and design technology projects in large and small museums. If the five of us, to quote a friend, Lisa Lee, were to unleash our radical imaginations, what are some things that this group could do to move us towards a more equitable future?
I won't start first, since I'm not non-museum people.
So, I mean, I sort of hinted at this. I think for me, I don't know about the five of us. That could be really fun. But I think the first thing is just this thing of like recognizing that we all have agency and going, right, what is it that I can do from where I am that opens up a broad conversation? And I think, NewsWeb, the new organisation that's coming up, that is this community, is there for the shaping to be right behind you when you try and do that stuff. If this is a community that understands that museums could be, because we understand the technology, because we understand what's possible in the kind of the digital era as opposed to the era where digital technology exists, then this organisation is there for you to shape such that when you want to do things differently in your museum, you've got something to fall back on, and you've got a thought leadership and a real kind of a thing with some weight to go to. So it's not just you as a lone voice. So shape this organisation, and I say that. I'm not being. Nancy didn't tell me to say that, right? But I believe it. And then I think let's have this conversation. Like there is a huge possibility. I think one of the things Lucy's pointing at is this sector could be so important in society. Like in my diagnosis, in the era of the consumer, where the shopping mall is the centre of the centre of the community, the city. I'm hesitating to use certain words now. Should I say? Yeah, thank you. But in the era of the citizen, like we need our cultural identities. We need to understand who we are. We need to understand where we're from and what art is, and we need us much more. And I say that as someone from outside the sector. I'm kind of going step up. Great, that's my idea.
I'm going to be very, kind of concrete. The first thing I would say is make sure that you have the right people in the room when you start these conversations. I mean, this is sort of my key point. You know, I think that we do a lot of work around creative empathizing. We do a lot of work around sort of trying to imagine who our visitors are and what they want. But there's no substitute for talking to people who are not you and yours and your cohort. And so when you start to think about getting people together, make sure that you have the right people in the room, and if you don't know who they are or what they want, you ask them. I mean, this is, it's an incredibly radical, it's just an incredibly radical thing. Ask people, So that's where I would start, and then listen to what they have to say, because it will be different from what you think it will be. Secondly, I would say, to whatever extent possible, think like a scientist. Art museums in particular, but museums in general, have historically been places of display. We need to shift them to being places of creation and discourse. And part of doing that is creating spaces where we're allowed to fail, where the notion of failure and success has been shifted to really be about anticipated versus unanticipated behaviors. I love what you had to say about skateboarding and that sort of being your way into urbanism, because it's a perfect example of unanticipated consequences in spaces that have been designed to function in certain ways. The museum space is a space that was designed in the 19th century to function in a certain way and to create certain kinds of visitor behaviors. But that's not necessarily how people are going to use it or what they're going to get out of it. They might just enjoy spending their time just busting our chops for writing really convoluted labels. A perfectly great experience doing that. So the importance of actually looking at what is being produced by the things you make, and that might be radically different from what you think it's going to produce, and that does not constitute a failure. So that's that.
As concrete as I get, make your signs editable. I think that's a great idea. I will come to your museum if I can write on your art labels.
Savannah Museum did that a few years ago.
Awesome.
Yeah.
The other thing, so time and space. Time, space, democracy. I spend a lot of time thinking about those things. I spend a lot of time thinking about why we have this weird space in our analog lived world where we do voluntary private things for public purpose. And I wonder how we're going to make that happen, because our lives are now at least always going to be complemented by digital space, if not entire things are only going to happen there. The principles that we're proposing for how we think about that are 4 at the moment. They keep changing, but they're 4 at the moment. We haven't answered the question yet. You can find these at a place called digitalimpact.io, and this is created by you for you. This is created by nonprofits for nonprofits. The 4 principles are this. What we need for digital space, what we need as organizations that use and rely on digital data, and remember, very quickly all people are going to be all digital all the time, and you want to be careful about how you do that. Is that the space we want to be creating, both in our walls or outside of our walls, is first and foremost pluralistic. Second, people are there at an opt-in basis. Everything needs to be consent-based. And nothing you can buy in the exhibit hall, and most of what you've probably created to sort of use your visit, any of this stuff, even my editing your thing, we've lost the idea of consent. The technologist will tell you it's dead, and I tell you it isn't. So let's figure out how to keep it alive. It's private. It's mine. It may have been co-created with you, but you better damn ask me before you go using it without my permission. And then it's open. And if you're going to design for open, you better begin with pluralistic, consent-based, and private. You can't get to any version of open that has any integrity. So those are actually principles that we're working on to actually sort of become, they're from the nonprofits we've talked to. We want to talk to you, we want to learn from you. Shared back to the nonprofit world about how to use your digital data. But I actually, this conversation and every conversation I've had here in the last couple of days has made me realize they're actually deep existential thoughts. And they're probably, if we're lucky, they will shape the way the World Wide Web 2.0 works and the way our governments monitor the way this stuff does. And if they don't, democracies will fail. They will fail. Civil society in the worlds of that current digital contemporary thinker, Alexander Hamilton, no reference to the show.
I thought you were going to start rapping.
I wish I could. I could, actually. I will. No. Are where we protect the interests of the minority against the tyranny of the majority. That's what museums are for. That's what libraries are for. That's what civil society is for. We need to live it in your physical space, and you need to help us carry that into the digital space.
Thank you. I came here with no set of principles to deliver today. I just am honored to be here and to peek into the world, and that you guys have it. It's awesome, and I thank you for the opportunity to be up here, everyone. Nancy and Gil. I do think that I will offer. I love the phrasing Gamynne said of creative empathy, and I feel that any success I've had or our organization has had, I've sort of always been placed as the sort of interpreter between, so for example in LA, like the sort of architecture and design community and the sort of bureaucracy and government structure and the sort of scholarly conversations. And I, for example, I got to teach at the Southern California Institute of Architecture for 2 years, and I'm trained in architecture design. And so I always will give a plug for sort of that cross-disciplinary conversation and understanding from creative and empathetic methods. And in that sort of note, I am absolutely honored to be here and be in your role.
And I'll just add to the radical imagining that I just continue to encourage us to explore the histories of our institutions and our collections, those histories that may not be very well documented, that might be a little ugly, because we're not going to know if we're replicating histories that we don't actually know about. So push in that general direction. So we are over time. Not sure we have time for Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so we'll wrap up.
We'll stick around. We're here all day if people want to.
Cool.
Can I share an example that I think is interesting for museum people to think about?
If you can do it like in a minute.
30 seconds. Brian Stevenson, Alabama, Equal Justice Initiative, making public art of the history of slavery and lynching in all the places that Alabama's already documented the other history. It is actually, as I think about it, it's a museum project. He's a lawyer. He runs a death penalty advocacy organization. Well, why isn't that a museum activity? Why isn't that strikes me as the kind of an example where you might find a partnership, where you can think about art coming from a history lived by people trying to be demonstrated in a way. It's Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. I don't know the name of it. It's a monument project, but it's he's leading efforts to build monuments so that in every place where there was a lynching in Alabama, for example, there would be the story of that person. And it's much bigger than that, but you can find out about it. Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative.
Cool. Well, thanks to Museums on the Web and the local committee for organizing this conference, and to our panelists today. I appreciate the rich and challenging discussion among the many takeaways. Let's remember to explore our own agency, to value productive tension, and to think about who's in the room, ask people, and listen to what they have to say. Let's leave with the words of, by invoking words shared by Alice Walker, and remember that we are the ones that we've been waiting for, and continue to push our institutions towards a more just and equitable future. Thank you.